Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to a Joy of SharePoint webinar. My name is Joy Apple. I have with me today Stephen Wilson, my esteemed colleague at Pate Group. And we are here today to talk about, I feel it's a divisive topic, but I actually said this line to a client this morning, so I feel I can say it to you all. Everyone hates your folders, except you. And I understand that if I have folders, you probably hate mine too, because they don't make sense to you. So Stephen and I have this conversation with each other, with clients, with just random people on the street quite a bit. So we thought we'd invite all of you all in and let's talk about folders, especially folders in SharePoint. So if you are relatively new to a Pate Group or Joy of SharePoint webinar, my name is Joy Apple. I'm a recently awarded Microsoft MVP and I'm a modern workplace strategist at Pate Group. I get to do this webinar. I get to help our clients figure out how to go from file shares and legacy versions of SharePoint and get into Microsoft 365 and all of the modern tools and functionality that brings with it. And that also means I get to work with Stephen. Stephen, how are you today?
I'm pretty good.
Yeah.
I have few complaints. If I tried harder, I could probably complain more.
You probably could. I mean, it's a Tuesday. Stephen, you've been at this game. I've been going for over 12 years now. What's your year count up to?
Too many. Probably. I mean, in this particular, this particular vein of technology, probably somewhere around 14 years, something like that.
Yeah. So between the two of us, we've got probably getting close to 30 years of working with folders and getting people out of the habit of folders. So we're going to jump into that today. If you don't like the name of today's webinar, it's totally Stephen's fault because we stole it and from a blog he was working on. That it goes even further.
Yeah, I was going to say mine was actually I hate your folders and your permissions. And so I didn't even leave room for the except for you. I just hated your folders and your permissions straight out. So like Joy cleaned it up a little.
Say it. Oh. Well, yeah, I soften. But that's how we play well together with clients, right? You come in kind of harsh, and then I try to play nice, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a good cop, bad cop kind of vibe.
For sure. So as we go through, if you have any questions or observations, please don't be shy to drop those in chat. We've got Stacy with us today. She's going to stop us. She's going to ask your questions. Join in because it's an important topic. We're poking fun at it and we're using very strong words here. But if we can get out of that old-fashioned habit, and yes, it's an old-fashioned habit of nesting and burying and hiding things inside of folders and using metadata to expose them appropriately and to be able to leverage the content and the features in SharePoint, oh my gosh, things just start to work better. So, and I found this just doing a random Google search because Bing search because that's what we do. So why do we use folders, or why have we used folders in the past? Well, honestly, because used to, that's all we had. If you were going to throw stuff on a file share or a server, folders were your means of organization. That's it. It was also your means of security and permissions. That's it. That's all you had. So a department got a folder, and then they put folders in their folder documents, or even, and I cringe when I see this, you'd see HR Joyce documents or something like that, right? It's what we're used to. It's what we've always had. And habits are hard to break. I am a very habitual person. I'm in the process of moving into a new house. All my habits are broken right now. It's kind of breaking me. It's hard to step away from what we're used to.
That's also why her internet may not be at its best today because she doesn't have internet in her new house just yet.
I don't. So give me a little bit of grace if things get a little weird. I'm on a mobile hotspot, on a wing and a prayer. So that's how we're doing this today. And I think, Stephen, even you'll say this more than I will, that it's not that folders in and of themselves are horrible. There are even times you recommend using them inside of modern SharePoint.
I wouldn't say I recommend them. I try and find a way to make it not quite as bad. There is a feature that a lot of people don't see in SharePoint where you can assign a folder so that it will set metadata by default. So if you drop something in the folder that says active, it'll set the status column to active. So in that case, I try to make them, more usable. If it just becomes a matter of, people are using, drag and drop a lot, or they're using OneDrive to organize stuff instead of going into SharePoint and dragging and dropping it on the page. They're just connecting to it with OneDrive and they're putting things in there. So, I mean, I understand that they have their need, and you and I have talked about it a lot. Microsoft kind of shot us in the foot because they were on board with us, advising people not to use folders all the time. And then suddenly they started using folders themselves when you create a channel in Teams.
It hurts me.
Yeah. And, like the OneDrive client and stuff like that, they don't really respect metadata in the normal way. So if people are using OneDrive to put things in place, the metadata kind of goes out the window. For sure. So we're kind of stuck with them. And so, like you said, we may be using some harsh language here. There may be times when we're saying things as if it's a very absolute thing, but the concepts are really more what we're talking about. Folders kind of pollute what you're doing because they're just a way to default to the lowest common denominator. And let's be honest, the way this all started is file cabinets. Like when they started designing computer file systems, they were like, well, what's our best analog version of this? And they started looking at file cabinets. It was the 50s and the 60s, people. Like when they were designing these file systems, they were calling things directories and folders because they were looking at file cabinets that were in the room with them. And so the fact that that was just the best example they had isn't really a good argument for continuing to use them forever.
Right. And it's not so much that, well, and the concept isn't horrible at all. We don't hate that concept, but it's how we end up implementing them. It's those old habits. It's the fact that I can go into a SharePoint document library and create a folder structure in the way I think about it. And that may make sense to a few of my coworkers, but odds are it's not going to make sense to everyone. I did a deployment planning workshop for the client a couple of weeks ago. And one of the people I was talking to, she goes, oh, no, I've got everything organized. It's really great. I have a 200 folder structure that I've got all of my stuff in. And I was thinking, wow, making notes, right? Wow, 200. And her coworker that was on the call too said, yep, and that's why I always have to email you because I can never find anything. Right? Yeah. So we've got that very structured organization going on that makes sense to one person. So now that one person is having to go email files around, duplicating them because the structure doesn't make sense to anybody else. And I will say there's something, Stephen and I have this conversation offline a lot. There's something in human nature that loves to nest. We love that hierarchy. We got to have a site and then a subsite and then a subsite and then a subsite. And then we're going to have a library with a folder and a folder and a folder and a folder and a folder. We just love it. We build tall buildings. We build deep folder structures. And we're going to kind of get to why that can be an issue as we go. But wow, once we start down that path, it just seems to get deeper and deeper. And how many times do you start going down that rabbit hole only to come into an empty folder or a folder that does nothing but hold other folders? So it's those moments where we start to step back a little bit and go, hey, what am I really trying to accomplish here? And then my last little bullet point I throw on the slide is a nod to where Stephen was going with his blog, because not only does he hate the folder structure, he hates the permissions that go around it too. Any of you that are longtime SharePoint admins, would love for you to do a shout out in chat, because we tend to find that the deeper a structure is, the more granular the permissions in that structure are going to be. So we tend to come in and go, okay, I've got my folder everyone can get to, but 5 people go to this folder, 6 people go into this subfolder, 3 people go into this subfolder, and it becomes this tangled up knot of permissions that honestly we begin to put more work into working on the permissions than we do managing the documents that's inside of them. It's very chaotic. Very chaotic.
And there's more to say about permissions. One thing I will add that I don't think we really cover in any of the slides, though, is that, and it's very minor for all the things that can cause slowdowns in SharePoint or Office 365 or anything. But if you break permissions on one folder in a library, you have slowed down that entire library, because by default, SharePoint looks at that library and it has a little flag that says, are the permissions the same all the way through, or have they been broken? And if they've been broken, it checks every step and says, is this where the permission's broken? Is this where the permission is broken? And it just repeats that for every object you try and look through. If it says the permissions aren't broken, it just skips that step and it just goes through knowing that your permissions are good. So, like I said, it's a very minor slowdown, but it's still there, and it doesn't matter if you've broken it in 20 places or if you've broken it in one place, that slowdown happens. If you've broken it in 20 places, it gets worse. Sure. Because it's tripping over it more often. It's saying, are your permissions broken? Yes. Oh, okay. Now I have to check your permissions.
I have to check everything.
Yeah.
Well, and so fun fact, and this is an old statistic, but I can't believe it's changed much. But a few years ago, the statistic was that, is it 30 seconds? Within 30 seconds, if a page is slow to load, somebody's calling the help desk. That's about the amount of time we're going to give a page to load. I'd be surprised if it's that high, honestly, because if you tell me it's going to take 30 seconds to get my cup of coffee warm, I'm impatient, right? So it doesn't take much time for a page to lag, and people are going to start calling, people are going to start complaining, and they're not going to be happy about it.
The more coffee Joy drinks, the slower the world seems. So for her, 30 seconds is like an hour and a half.
It's true. And this is my fun slide. I had to put this in somewhere because there's this nature now. So we've got our folders and we're going to start organizing, and we do, and we go off to the races, and we end up with these kind of crazy nesting. And I stole these directly from Stephen. So this is where the fun starts. When we start nesting these folders, URL links get exceeded. Now that we're not doing subsites in modern SharePoint, right? Not doing subsites in modern SharePoint, this gets a little bit better. But when you do library folder, 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 then by default that URL is getting longer. If you're still on-prem, you're definitely going to be impacted more by this. Search won't find things in those long URL.
That's what we all sound like to Joy. Who's had a lot of coffee. So she's
backup can't find it. So if somebody has to do a restore, that content's not been backed up. Did my internet go funny?
Yeah. Okay, it's going a little funny, so I'll go on with this. What she's talking about is we have, limits on how long the URLs can be in SharePoint. So you can have up to 256 characters, I think it is, maybe it's 255, in a URL. in SharePoint. There are some places where Microsoft has talked about extending that out to like 400 or something along those lines, but you know, it is a limit. And I'm gonna share my screen very quickly here. This is a real example. I have changed just a very small bit of it to make sure that there's no identifiable information in it. But give me just a sec here. This example, I just ran across this the other day. And here, you know, they have the name of the server. This was on-prem. And this was the subsite. Like Joy said, we're not doing subsites anymore. If that doesn't... Did I lose you guys? Or can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, just checking. If the idea that we're not doing subsites anymore surprises anyone, let us know. We'll do a session on that and why subsites are something that you should probably reevaluate as well. This is the document library where it was just documents. And you can see, you know, I couldn't have made this up better myself. They had a folder called Credit Union Loan Submissions, Bama University Credit Union Loan Submissions. So right there, Credit Union Loan Submissions, they repeated that twice. That made the URL that much bigger. Southeast Bama Holdings, comma LLC, that was a folder name. And then this is the file name. And in the file name, they have reiterated one of the pieces of metadata. They've added a couple more. And, you know, when we tell people about metadata in SharePoint and they say things like, no, I don't, you know, our people don't really get metadata. They don't understand what you're talking about. And they clearly do understand it because they're building it into the folder names. They're building it into the file names. I'm sure the reason all this data is here is because they needed it. They needed that information for each one of these files. And so they didn't just do this for fun. And so I mocked up this same library in our test environment. Were you going to say something, Joy?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think part of the problem is we've not done a good marketing push for metadata over the years. Folders were created based on something relatable, recognizable, and familiar. And then you and I come in and say metadata, and people go, oh, what? What are you talking about? But I found recently, which is sad that it took me this long, that if I equate that to the way they like to look at stuff in a spreadsheet, and I think it's because my brain doesn't think spreadsheet ways. You know, you can slice and dice your libraries the way you do a spreadsheet with columns and rows. Oh, they say.
Yeah, and that's exactly, so like this, I just did this library, so credit union. And obviously my internet is blazing fast too. And then Bama University Credit Union. And then Southeast Bama Holdings. And then my giant file. But if I look at that from a metadata perspective, I built the same thing. I shortened the name of the file. I took the customer number that was part of the file name, made it a column. The document type, it's a credit union loan submission. I put the renter and the tenant because that's what I assumed that information in the file was. And that's probably something that everybody in that organization knows. They know what those names mean. But from the folders, I really couldn't tell for sure. And from the file name, I couldn't tell for sure. So some of this I made up, but the application applies. This is the renter, this is the tenant, this is the property address, this is when the lease started, this is when the lease ended. And now if I have this in metadata, if I have 50 of these out here, I can sort by any of these columns. I can look it up by any of this information. I don't have to look for it in that giant file name that we had before. I can use this to consolidate all the customer IDs. Even if I've got 10 different document types for that customer, I can just create a view that shows me only those customer ID numbers. And so no matter what those documents are, I can see them all in one place. So I don't have to go into 6 different folders to find 6 different types of documents. I can create a view that puts it all together. So we had a demo, and Joy, anytime you want to hop back on any of this, let me know. But
I'm going to let you drive. I don't trust my internet to keep going. But you know, that customer ID, we have a client that their unique ID is for a student and a student ID, and they currently move documents from folder to folder to folder based on an application status. But instead, if we follow that line of logic, now we don't have to move content. We simply update the status in a column, and the document never has to move. That becomes a lot less overhead.
And we had that discussion, I think it was last week with that customer, where we were describing it to the people who were managing that content. And they were like, oh, that would be a lot easier. That would be great. Being able to group these things together easily, looking up things, so that we can see, what all the documentation for this particular student is all in one view. Because what I asked them was, what information do you use to find your document? Because they had a very deep structure to get to things, but they had to know several things to get to the document they needed. Because otherwise they couldn't figure out how to get through their folders. So what they ended up doing mostly was search for the student ID number. Go ahead.
We have a question. One thing that irks my users is the repetition of the column name before their category name, like status, progress, not started, completed. Is there a way to hide the column name when in grouped by sorting?
No. So you could do a different view for whatever that sorting is. But you can't make it so that just by clicking on a group in the sorting that it automatically sorts out those things. So if you wanted to do a view that showed just one particular grouping, you could limit it down to whatever columns that you liked. But if you want it to change, so let's see here. I've got this one. So if I switch this to no folders, and you're kind of blowing my demo here because we had a whole thing going.
It's worth it.
Oh, wait. Yeah, okay. So here, if I had it grouped in a certain way, I couldn't make it so that when I click on that grouping, that everything, like the color and the rank and the sides disappear. But I could create a view that doesn't have any of those things. So I don't know if that helps. If we could get to your data and look at it, more specifically, for your use cases. If your users are getting frustrated by that stuff, part of that just may be that your default view has too much information in it, because you don't have to show all of the data that you're using in the view. So even if you're using that data to create the view, like if you're using it to group things, you don't have to show that column that you're using to make that grouping necessarily. If it's just a qualification. So you can create something that is, if this equals, some value, you can do that check without actually showing that column on the screen. So it may just be that you're, go ahead.
I was gonna say, one of the magic pieces of doing a brand new view too is now you could give them a button, a link. They can have a shortcut in their browser of choice that just takes them straight to that view too.
Yes.
That would kind of slice out some of the superfluous information that maybe they as a user don't need to see at that moment in time.
Right. And so, you know, it just depends on how they're getting to it on a regular basis. So if there's a way to limit the amount of columns that they need by default and then expand it only when they actually need that data to be there, that may be the way to approach it. So, you know, as I said, you know, we had built this kind of as a demo. Here, I built something that was kind of folder heavy. And first, the folders were after colors of the rainbow. So it should have spelled Roy G. Biv, but I couldn't make it do that. So I had to set up the rank just so I could make it spell it out, the, you know, Roy G. Biv the way I wanted it to in the first place. So I can control how the information is sorted by creating a column that has, you know, the thing that I'm really concerned about. So if I want to do it by, you know, alphabetical or whatever, I can do that easily enough. But if I want things to be shown in a particular order, I can just create a column and give them an order or a ranking so that I can show them that way.
So you don't have to put AAA in front of a folder to make it the first.
Exactly. You don't have to do underscore A underscore B. You don't have to make those kinds of things happen so that it sorts the way you want it to. You can actually just give it a ranking that's fairly arbitrary if you want it to sort in a certain way. This rank could represent anything. It could be what year you started with the customer, what ranking you have the customer, like, you know, number one is the customer that makes the most money for you. Any of those kinds of things you can use to sort data. So you can assign it as an item in the columns. And I don't have, like, I can have a sorted column that is part of my my view, but I don't have to show it here. So I could have a view called ranked where I could be sorting by the rank, but you don't see it. So just because you have a column doesn't mean you have to show it, doesn't mean that you have to let the users necessarily interact with it on any kind of meaningful, you know, basis. You could set this up without their knowledge even. So here, if I go into, you know, R for red, and again, my internet apparently is a little slow today as well. I've got 3 and 5. And you're like, well, what does 3 and 5 mean? That's kind of our point. You know, in a lot of ways, people will name things stuff, and we're like, I don't know why it's named this. You know, we'll see folders all the time in customers where it'll be data. That'll be the name of the folder. Saturday, that'll be the name of the folder. And we're like, why are these things named these? So it makes sense to them, but it doesn't make sense to other people necessarily. So you saw, you know, I got rid of folders in the previous view. And now I'm a little deeper in. And so here it's just showing everything at that level. So it's the same view that you saw a minute ago, where if I went to no folders, it showed me where I was without folders. And here it shows everything. So in some ways you can use folders to kind of limit those views. So that's one of the uses that folders do have, is you can use this kind of view to look at only the things that appear in that folder. But it takes a rethinking of how you're using the folders. Instead of just using them as a way to shuffle things along, you can put things in specific categories and then use views to influence how that category is viewed. But here we just have all of the files that are in this library. But here I've got sides, star, pen, that's a pentagram, a star, and the number of sides it has. So now sides makes more sense than just having a folder named 3. If I do pretty, now I see the images. And so then I can sort things, and you can't do this with folders. SharePoint doesn't look at folders as something that can be used for search. It doesn't use them as something that you can use to qualify a view by building it on the view. You can do it by going into the folder and then applying the view, but the other way around doesn't work. You can't create a view, show me only the things in this folder. So I can choose only the things that are classified as red. And there they are. But things can be more than one thing at a time in this kind of view. So I can have things that are red and pentagons. And then I've got one red pentagon. And I can do this kind of filtering only based on the metadata. I can't do it based on the folder. So if I am looking at this with no folders at all, and I use these filters, I can get very specific about what I want. So I could do it for rankings. I could do it for, lots of different things. There's no red pentagon that's also ranked with 3. So it doesn't show up. If I get rid of the 3, there's my pentagon again.
And this starts to give us power of how we can slice and dice the data because I know a lot of people that have their stuff in SharePoint, then they go export, or they build a spreadsheet actually, so they can track their data in a spreadsheet based on what is actually in their libraries in SharePoint. So now if you think about this, I could actually take that no folder view, I could take this information when I get rid of the folders, go stick it in an Excel spreadsheet, actually just go export it, and I get one cohesive view of all my stuff all together. It starts to become powerful.
And this is complete nonsense to Excel. This view right here. But this no folders view, that makes complete sense in Excel. Everything about that is comprehensible in Excel. You got your file name, the number of sides, the shape type, the color, and the rank. You can cut that up all you want in Excel. Now, there are people who will ask us, how can I dump this out into Excel when it's so folder heavy? And the first thing Joy will say is, well, we can do a view that doesn't show the folders. But they'll say, well, how can we, how do we know what folder it's in then? And then we have to build a column that shows what the folder name is. It gets pretty nonsensical quickly. The folders just get in the way for the most part. So by grouping things in particular ways, you can use the views to clarify instead of having to know too much information first to get to it. And that's what we find a lot of is if you ask people, okay, you've got these, 200 folders. What information do you have to find a file in there? And a lot of times the answer is, I ask Linda, because she already knows. She already knows where that file is. But if I'm looking for it cold, Linda is sick today, how do I find that file? I don't know the name of it, but I know the customer's name. Well, the customer's name may be in the file. It may be in the file name. It may be a folder. But then you start getting answers like, well, most of the time, if it's, customer ABC, it'll be in the ABC folder, unless it's pending, and then it's in the pending folder. And then under pending, it's in ABC. So then you have 2 places that you have to look. And that can multiply. But if you just mark the customer as a column, you can look for ABC and it'll show you all the ABCs, no matter what the status is, whether it's pending, canceled, closed, anything. You can just look for the customer, ABC, and you've got it right there.
And an unfortunate fact for those of us that are in SharePoint Online and still are really wanting to cling to those folder structures, the deeper we nest our content into those structures, the less of a rank search gives it when returning you your results. So the deeper we bury it, the less likely that's going to be on our first page of search results when we're going through SharePoint. And that's one of the beautiful things about modern SharePoint is how powerful search is. So we want to try to make sure we have stuff up high enough that we're really getting the full advantage of it.
And the last thing that you want to do is have like a common term be one of your folder names. And you're like, well, I can find it because, you know, I'll use search. Well, search isn't going to respect the folders at all. And if it's a common term, like say tenant, like we were looking at that rental agreement before, every document that has the word tenant in it is going to pop up when you search.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a metadata column that has tenant, then you can look for that tenant's name in that column. But if that tenant's name isn't in the name of the file or in the file itself, you're lost.
Yeah.
And that was.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the example that I had where I shortened the name of the file, I left the customer number or the customer ID in the file name because you don't want to have, 400 documents that are all called rental agreement. And the only way to tell which one is which is just the metadata in the columns. Mm-hmm. You put something relevant in the file name, but you don't have to put all of the relevant information in the file name, like the address.
Think of the power too. So we pull out, so I remember in the long URL you had, if I'm remembering correctly, a date is in there. It would be really 2 days. That's right. The start date and the end date. It would be really hard to go to that and say, okay, SharePoint, find me every document that has an end date for this year in its title. Right? That would be super hard to do. But if I'm collecting that in a column, I just go, okay, SharePoint, show me every end date that's for 2021.
Mm-hmm. Or just sort it by end date or,
yeah,
any of those kinds of things. And that's why when I built it, and I'm assuming, like I said, I didn't know for sure, but I saw 5320 and 6920 and 53121. Mm-hmm. I assumed that's what that meant, so I just made a column for that. I could be wrong. They could have been looking for something else entirely. But, just imagining what maybe they were shooting for, that's what I made the columns. Also, one of the things I'll point out here, look at these names here. They put a space on either side of the hyphen. They put a comma and then a space. Those are the kinds of things that waste space in your URL. Excess spaces, that made this so much longer than it had to be. And so if you just cut down on those things in your file names, in your folder names, get rid of duplications like credit union loan submissions. They use that exact same phrase twice. That kind of stuff, makes those URLs longer. Looking for those kinds of duplications can also help you out a lot with just organizing your data, because the more you use these phrases, it's in the file names, it's in the folder names, it's in the library names, the more you clutter up your search results.
Absolutely. And the more folders we have, the more at risk we are for duplication of data. So if I could go and drop the same document into every one of those 7 folders that Stephen had, and SharePoint will never say a word to me because that folder is giving it a unique URL. That means when it's time to update the documentation, I have to go hunt down every copy that's out there and update it. And what are the odds it's going to happen? But if I'm uploading it and I'm assigning it the proper metadata, I'm not going to duplicate it. SharePoint's going to sort it into the view where it fits the metadata. So I don't have to think about where to put it. All I have to do is make sure that I've given it the appropriate shape type, size, color, and it'll just fall where it needs to in the views. And there's no duplication going on because that's one item with one name, one URL. If I try to upload another one, it's going to say, hey, this is already here. Are we replacing or did you just goof up?
And the screenshots that Joy used earlier, she said she had taken straight from my blog. If you look at that screenshot, it shows like, the day's menu in 3 different folders. We see that kind of stuff a lot too, where they have the same content. They've just put it in 3 or 4 different places, but they've divided it up, team 1, team 2, team 3. And they're like, well, team 1 can't see team 2 and team 2 can't see team 1 or 3. So we want them all to have the same information, but we put it in these folders and we've locked them down from the other 2 teams. So we've duplicated all of our information 3 times. Right.
And honestly, if we're looking at this, is it a breach of security if team 3 sees what the team 2 lunch menu is? Probably not, unless we don't want them to know that team 2 is having steak. I don't know.
And even worse, like when I was imagining this, it's the same menu. They don't actually have 3 different menus. They've just named it team 1, team 2, team 3, but they've got the same document in there 3 times, but they've changed the name of it. So they can't even use search to find it. If they want to update the menu, they have to go in and manually replace it in 3 different places, and they have to know where it is already. So
and typically, this happens because we're trying to be conscientious for our coworkers and our colleagues. Well, team 2, it's just a lot for team 2 to have to deal with if they see all of team 1 and all of team 3. So I'm just going to do it this way. But honestly, you're really creating more work for other people. And heaven forbid someone on team 1 sits next to someone on team 2 and they're trying to compare notes and work on their job together, and they can't because they've been locked out of something because we thought we were helping, but we weren't. So we kind of have that reflex. And I see people doing it with teams now too, and they create a private channel because, well, we're afraid if they have all these other channels, it's going to be too much for them to see. Instead of teaching our users or trusting that our coworkers are fairly intelligent, that's how they got their job, of how to just go to where they need to go to find their stuff.
And that's a conversation that we have a lot of times with our customers where we ask them about the permissions and we say, is this about trying to guide the user? Is it just to make it easier so they don't see the things that they don't need? Or is it actually about security? Is it a security breach for them to see, the wrong thing?
Yep.
And so
that's a view.
And that's it. And we can have something called lunch menu, and we can have, applicable team as a column, and we can have 1, 2, and 3 in that column. And so if we create a view that says, if, this column has the value 2 in it, then show it to team 2.
Yep.
And we can create a team 2 view, and it shows the lunch menu, the hand washing instructions, and the dental hygiene document to team 2, but it doesn't show why we hate team 3 because they're not in on that necessarily.
Nor should they be. You were in a mood when you made this demo, I can tell.
Look, team 3 knows what they did, all right?
They know. So let me get my slides to advance now, she said optimistically. There it is. So why we hate this? And Stephen, this does touch on the slowdown, at least I thought I put it in here. We're wasting space. The folders, they're really an illusion, but if we're looking at how people get to this stuff, we're really not probably clicking through 200 folders. We know where something is, or it's something we go to all the time. We've got those 5 documents we use the most. So we're going to have a shortcut. We're going to have a favorite, or we just go straight to that folder and we know where it is. So really that whole structure's not really needed. We're kind of wasting space. Any of the duplicates that get put in there are kind of wasting space. We're wasting time. Because if I have to go find that lunch menu in 3 different folders and update it 3 different times, wow, it could be better. And honestly, one of the things I find out when I'm doing my discovery conversations with people is they have no idea which document is their single version of truth in the workplace. There's so many duplicates. It's emailed and you save it on your desktop, or you save it in your personal file folder, or you do whatever with it, or you go back and you find the most recent email you can find. You don't know if it's right. We don't know. We have no faith in what we're viewing is that's actually the single version of the truth, because it's just stuff everywhere. And on the granular permission side of things, not only is it going to slow down the system, it's going to waste your time managing those granular permissions. The best practice for SharePoint always has been, I hesitate to say always will be, we'll see, is you secure the largest object as that's possible. And that has always been a site. It's always been the largest object that we can go secure and say this content is sensitive. It should only be viewed by a particular team. So we're going to go create a space with the appropriate audience. People that shouldn't be there aren't there, and let it live. That's not a waste of space. That's a respect of permissions and security. Those granular permissions, if they're not truly necessary, we're just trying to reduce clutter, you're going to disrupt the workflow of your department. People can't work together because we've created silos. And that's one of the things we want to get away from, is those silos of data. It can give the impression that the whole team's not trusted. And someone, Steve, I picked this up out of your blog, someone has to have a high level of permissions to manage everything that's got broken permissions. So right there, that scale that we've tried to implement has already been tipped. Just threw it out the window.
And a lot of times that's, that person, maybe somebody in IT, or it may be somebody in your department, but that a lot of times is the last person that has the time to manage all that stuff.
It's very true. I always see it's usually the person that's has some kind of executive level assistant role, and they're trying to manage an entire group of people plus all this other stuff. SharePoint's just been handed to them, another duty is assigned, and that's a lot. That's a lot to do to something. So in the last minute or two, why are we still using folders? Probably because it's what we're used to. Metadata looks a little difficult. Or as the example came up, it feels superfluous to have the name of the column right next to the selection of the column when it's grouped. So people, they don't like the way it looks, so we don't like it. Or I like the way I do it, and I want to be able to do it my way. You can still do it your way with views. I actually go into almost every team that I'm in a lot, and I create a view of that documents library called no folders. So I don't have to dig through the channels to find content, and I don't have to go to SharePoint and look through folders. I have one view that shows no folders, and it's not in anybody else's way, but it shows me the content of that documents library the way I want to see it. It's sneaky, but it's pretty darn awesome.
And in a lot of ways, it's more powerful than, having things divided up into folders, because like Joy said, you can create a link on a page that goes straight to a particular view of a library. That view can encompass everything in that library. Whereas if you put a link to a folder, you have to either repeat everything that you need in that one folder. So like our lunchroom, dental hygiene example, where you have to have all that information in one folder. Or you can create a view that shows just the stuff that you want. You can have a column that says, okay, what is my audience here? And I don't mean like audiencing for SharePoint, but I can say, all right, I want everyone to see this document. So I can mark all in that column, or team 1 or team 2 or team 3. And I can have that in that column and then use that column to organize my view. And I can use that view's information to drive, showing 500 files. It doesn't all have to be in one place, in one folder. It's whatever I want to select through an entire library.
Yep. It's power. It definitely is. Folders do tend to be a more rigid way of working with content. And when we break out of that rigid mold and look at those columns, look at the information that's there, look at those large libraries. Should some of those big libraries with big folders, should some of that maybe broken out to their own sites? Or should those large folders actually become another library? Especially if there's permissions around it, we should maybe be looking at bumping that up to a larger object. Those big folders with lots of subfolders, could we dig into those and say, you know what, I've got a subfolder for state, a subfolder for category with lots of stuff in there. Could state be a column? And then I can go tag my information. Should category be a column? I can go tag my data with the appropriate information. Now in one view, I could see just Oklahoma, or I could see Oklahoma and Ohio, or I could see Oklahoma and Ohio if it's, I don't know, an outline. I've got the flexibility there to do with it whatever I need to. And that becomes very powerful once you get used to it. And that's the key. Breaking out of that mold and changing that habit, it's slow. It's always slow to learn how to do something new. But once you get that new habit formed, it's amazing how fast it truly can be for you.
We have a question.
Okay.
Since Teams creates separate SharePoint sites, how do you get cross-team access to files?
They all need to be on the team, or if that makes you kind of clench up, you don't like the idea of Joy being in every one of those teams, but there's documentation in every one of those teams Joy legitimately needs to see, consider, I'm going to say a communication site or a team site without a team, and put the content that everyone, that this broader audience needs access to on that site. And then within the individual teams where people break out to do stuff, tab to those shared resources or those common documents and spreadsheets.
And the other thing, when we're asked that question, I've seen it happen both with myself and with Joy. When somebody asks that question, a lot of times where we start to question why your teams are structured the way they are. We see a lot of organizations that default to like an org chart and say, okay, we want accounting and HR and sales and IT. We want those separate teams. But then when we start talking to them, they're like, oh, but the people from accounting need to see this stuff in HR, and then that bleeds over into the marketing group that we haven't even talked about yet. And the executives need to be able to see this and this and this. And that's when we start talking about cross-functional teams. That maybe you should be building teams that are made out of team members, not departments. So if you have a sales team, that's not the sales department, because a lot of times you have a marketing person that works with particular salespeople or particular customers. You may have an accountant that deals with those accounts in particular. You may have an account manager, and they're not in the sales team, but they work with those same customers. And so maybe you should be building your teams around the customer groupings instead of around your departments.
Yeah.
And it's just it's sort of like the folders thing. It's the way that people think of it. They're always thinking like, let's break this into these particular silos because every site we see has accounting, IT, HR. But if that's not how your organization runs, you should maybe relook at how you're structuring teams in the first place.
And don't be afraid to have a lot of teams, because accounting, it's probably going to need multiple teams if there's security around certain functions that certain groups that break out of accounting do, those sub-departments or those functional business areas. That's to be expected. That's fantastic because you're providing security and the ability to collaborate. But again, like Stephen said, accounting probably also needs to work with HR on some stuff. They're probably also going to work with sales and marketing on some stuff. So accounting is going to be in a lot of other teams with other people too. That's okay. That's actually fantastic. When you want to start stepping away from the team side is when you start going, okay, but then there's this stuff that can't be edited by all these people. They can only view it. If they're a viewer, that means they're a consumer, not a member. So we need to start thinking about an appropriate place. Stacey, I think we're defining another webinar. So we need to, figure out where that goes that respects the permission and the role.
Mm-hmm. And it all leads back to those, those same conversations. So the overarching, flow of this is to re-examine how you're organizing your data. A lot of times, the folders are a very static way of doing things, and your teams don't need to be a very static way of doing things necessarily. So as you're building these things, you want to re-examine how you've always done things a little bit. And that's really hard to do. The customer that Joy was talking about earlier, the school, we even recommended to them because they're in a hurry, like a lot of us, and they've got a lot of data to move. And so they're like, yeah, we just can't reorganize all this content. That's fine, but maybe build a new library, and as of January 1st, start building in a new way. And yes, that means you'll have to look in two places for a while. For a while, you're going to be like, okay, it was before January, so it's in this other place, But if it's successful, that gives you motivation for taking some of that old data and putting it in the new location and tagging it with metadata and doing all the things that we're talking about right now. But you're looking at all of this past data, these 10 or 12 years of data, and you're like, how do we wedge all that into this completely new structure? You don't have to do it all overnight. You just kind of have to break things at some point and say, this is the new way of doing it. And we're not always fond of new ways of doing things, but if we can get our toe in the pool, sometimes we realize it's a lot nicer there.
Yeah. All right. Wow. Stephen, I think that was the perfect summary statement.
I try.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for bearing with me during my technical difficulties today. I should have put my background up earlier of the dog in the room that's on fire saying this is fine. But thank you. We appreciate you all being here. Thank you for your questions and your observations. As always, that's what makes this so much fun. And I hope you find us out on Twitter if you haven't already. I'm also on Instagram. I don't think Stephen has tried that social media platform yet.
No, because it would just be screenshots of my computer mostly, and nobody wants to see that.
Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Send us emails if you have more questions.